visuals obviously aren't the be-all and end-all for any video game, there are a heavy selection of players that tend to be turned off by an ugly art style or lo-fi graphics. But every so often a developer will get daring enough to release a game that looks intentionally revolting to the gaming mainstream. Some of these games are even ranked among the very best examples of their respective genres, and while their obtuse, unconventional approaches to art design certainly took some getting used to, it was ultimately well worth sticking with in each case. If any of these 10 games actually did look conventionally pretty, it's likely they wouldn't hit the same way. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 great video games that are ugly on purpose. Number 10, UNDERTALE. While UNDERTALE is an incredible masterwork for a bunch of different reasons, including the fact that it was made by just one person, it's not exactly a looker in the graphics department. As with many games produced by small teams, or in this case, one guy, UNDERTALE touts an unassuming retro pixel art style, with sprite-based low-detail environments and characters that are regularly offensive to the eyes. UNDERTALE just so happens to be such a clever and inventive spin on RPG tropes that it's tremendously enjoyable regardless. Plus, just when you think you've seen everything the game has to offer, Photoshop Flowey happens. Depending on your playstyle, you might end up facing off against this truly hideous abomination at the game's end. The neutral route's monstrous kaiju-like final boss, which is rendered in a markedly more grotesque, realistic style compared to everything else before it. The jarring nature of Photoshop Flowey's design only makes encountering it all that much more disgusting and shocking. That ensures that UNDERTALE's rough-hewn visuals represent far more than just another attempt to cash in on 8-bit nostalgia. Number 9, The Binding of Isaac. Now this won't be the only time that a game by Edmund Macmillan appears on this list, because what can we say? That guy just really knows how to make visuals in a game that elicit this just really raw, primordial disgust. One such game is his legendary 2011 roguelike, The Binding of Isaac, which is filled to the brim with deeply off-putting imagery, from penile and feces-based enemies to a dominant aesthetic defined by only the most soul-crushingly dreary browns and reds. While it's fair to say that the original Flash version of the game was basically ugly out of necessity, the slicker 2014 remake, The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, nevertheless retains that holistic original art style, which is 100% consistent with the game's darkly transgressive themes and ideas. The Binding of Isaac's willful desire to disgust pretty much everybody won't be for a lot of people, but that's just fine, because if you are a fan of this one, you know that beneath all of that slightly unattractive veneer is one of the best roguelikes ever made. Number 8, KANE and LYNCH 2 Dog Days. While the original KANE and LYNCH wasn't exactly a paragon of aesthetically appealing craftsmanship, sequel Dog Days saw developers IO Interactive make a concerted effort to ugly up basically every aspect of the series' visual style. KANE and LYNCH 2 is designed to resemble the aesthetic of carnage captured on a 90s camcorder, complete with potentially nauseating shaky camera work and intentionally garish color contrast, where the darks are crushed into oblivion and the lights are blindingly bright. The game's image also regularly pixelates and distorts, which works in stark contrast to the original's more conventional style. And yet, it totally works in accentuating the oppressive, nihilistic vibe the developers were shooting for, transcending mere visual scuzziness to become basically experimental. The game's art director, Rasmus Poulsen, even took a camcorder to Shanghai to capture reference materials for the desired aesthetic, and went on to dub KANE and LYNCH 2 an anti-game, a rebuke to all the flippantly violent shooters on the market. While it's far from perfect mechanically, KANE and LYNCH 2 dared to go where many games don't, putting all of this wanton violence and grotesque design in gamers' faces and then asking them if they're still having fun. Number 7, HOTLINE Miami. Ultra-violent top-down shooter HOTLINE Miami is a game that few people are probably playing for the visuals. Sure, its pixel art throwback style emerged at just the right time in the indie game boom, before players had again become tired of it, but there's still little escaping the fact that this isn't a game that's pleasant to look at all. For starters, the environments are largely incredibly bland and thrown together. The animations are rudimentary, and the fleeting glimpses of people's actual faces look like they were drawn by somebody's kid brother. And yet, it's all entirely in step with the 80s throwback vibe the game is going for. Most importantly though, the moment-to-moment combat is so brilliantly done and so fiendishly tense that the aggressively rough-edged visuals can't hurt it. Hell, you might even find yourself charmed by these horrid, detail-devoid textures, and I'd put myself in that category. Number 6. Psychonauts. Though Psychonauts 2 was largely well received by fans and critics alike, believe it or not, there were those who complained that it didn't look ugly enough, that the original's more disconcerting nightmare fuel aesthetic had been given an overly slick makeover. Psychonauts' commercial failure upon release was often attributed to the game's willfully off-putting art style, especially its aggressively grotesque character designs, namely protagonist Raz, whose ill-proportioned facial features are enough to give anyone the heebie-jeebies. Similarly, given that the game predominantly takes place in surreal mindscapes, the level design is fittingly unconventional, employing unsettling imagery to keep the player uncomfortable at almost all times. This manifests most infamously in the game's climactic meat circus level, taking place in a literal carnival of dead animals, as is sure to revolt not only vegetarians but, well, basically everybody. But Psychonauts' ingenuity ensured that it would become a cult classic even if it couldn't make it with the mainstream. Partly because legendary director Tim Schafer, who having previously directed Grim Fandango, knows a thing or two, committed wholeheartedly to the game's twisted, uncanny style. Number 5. Cruelty Squad. Cruelty Squad is, more than most games on this list, a title that absolutely won't be for everyone, and that's primarily because its visual style is so unabashedly repulsive. This isn't a game you'd ever want to play hungover, that's for sure. An acid-dipped riff on classic stealth action games like Hitman, Cruelty Squad casts players in the role of an assassin tasked with carrying out various assignments. The big difference? You're a biologically augmented assassin existing within what the developer calls a sewage-infested garbage world. Lovely. The various sandbox levels and all the UI elements are willfully hideous in what's both a throwback to underground FPS games of decades past and something of a response to the realism sought by modern military shooters. The blocky, low-polygon graphics and nauseatingly garish textures are tailor-made to induce as much discomfort in the player as possible, evoking the vibe that this is something you probably shouldn't be playing. Yet underneath its purposefully gross aesthetic is a genuinely riveting, refreshingly straightforward tactical shooter unencumbered by the excessive, overbaked mechanics of modern FPS games. Number 4. Manhunt. For all the flack it received for its brutal violence, to the extent it was even accused and later cleared of inspiring a murder in the UK, there's no denying that Rockstar weren't trying to deceive anyone with Manhunt's makes you want to shower aesthetic. Given that Manhunt tasks the player with participating in a series of snuff films in order to earn their freedom, it's fitting that the developer decided to style their game in the vein of a grungy, grotty VHS tape that spent years festering in a police evidence lockup. The various executions that you'll be meting out on your enemies are typically seen through a VHS filter, complete with lines across the screen and artifacting. While not pleasant to the eye, this style is absolutely effective in keeping the player on an uneven keel, ensuring they're always unnerved and anxious about what's coming next. Throw in the fairly bland texture work and lack of colors, and this is a game that bleeds violent, miserable atmosphere from every pore. If certainly not as refined as most of Rockstar's beloved AAA efforts, Manhunt nevertheless remains a cult classic for a reason. It pushed the bounds of taste and decency while mostly making good on its Running Man-inspired concept. Number 3. Papers, Please. Sometimes a repellent art style is completely appropriate for a game that's trying to represent the more unseen and insidious horrors in society. That's certainly true of 2013's puzzle simulation game Papers, Please, where players assume the role of a border-crossing immigration officer in a fictional dystopian nation. Throughout the game, you're tasked with inspecting immigrants' documentation to determine the legitimacy of their case, or whether they might be a political dissident seeking to undermine the state. Ethical dilemmas naturally run rife through the masterful game, if you're able to vault the considerable hurdle that is the game's flat, unappealing visual style, that is. If someone showed you a screen grab of Papers, Please sight unseen, you'd be forgiven for assuming this game was probably 30-odd years old. However, the muddy textures and general lack of visual detail only further underline the drudgery of the player's miserable job throughout the game. Meanwhile, the immigrant characters you're tasked with examining are rendered in such uncanny, unappealing pixel art form as to accentuate the dehumanizing manner in which the state machine regards them. Genius. Number 2. Minecraft. Now, anybody who knows anything about Minecraft will appreciate that its blocky 3D aesthetic is one of its most identifiable elements, and certainly hasn't prevented it from selling 238 million copies and becoming the single best-selling video game of all time. Though there is some quaint charm to Minecraft's lo-fi visuals, I think most of us could agree it's pretty ugly. While players have created their own stunning texture modifications over the years, and the game does now support ray tracing, that blocky, ill-aged style still prevails to this very day. Though developer Mojang announced an aesthetic overhaul with a planned 4K super-duper graphics pack in 2017, it was ultimately cancelled in 2019 due to technical issues with getting the pack to work across platforms. Yet this only really seems to confirm that Minecraft's low-rent visual performance seems to be one of the keys to its success. It's simple, clean, and easy for kids and adults alike to understand, while technically undemanding enough to work on basically every gaming device known to man. Minecraft's complex crafting system likely wouldn't be so popular if the game opted for a more detailed, even realistic style. And so this more pared-down aesthetic fits the game's design philosophy like a glove. Number 1. Super Meat Boy. Edmund McMillan, yes, he's back again, so Super Meat Boy is absolutely one of the genre-defining platformers of the last 15 years. Even putting aside the fact that its aesthetic is kinda revolting. At first glance, you could be forgiven for assuming that the game was just one of the thousands of low-rent Flash games released in the early 2000s. So hideous is its overall style. For the bulk of the game, the art design is defined by drab, colorless industrial environments, seemingly designed to further demoralize players through this oppressively challenging yet compulsively addictive piece of work. It's a testament to the fluidity of the platforming itself that Super Meat Boy remains such a joy to play. You kinda just zone out the environments at some point. Ironically, the long-awaited sequel Super Meat Boy Forever was widely criticized by fans for its slicker, more polished, and more colorful aesthetic, which many felt ran counter to the first game's grimy ethos. That is the end of our list, but let me know down in that comment section if you can think of any more great games that are ugly on purpose. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm at Jess McDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great gaming lists.